Today on the Take On Board podcast, I'm speaking with Olivia Giudice about, well, all things risk committees and also chairing risk committees. Before we start the podcast today, I, as always, would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. For me, I am on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to pay my respects to any other First Nations people who may be listening today. I acknowledge their continuing connection to land, waters, skies, culture and country. I support Voice, Treaty and Truth for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia, and I encourage others in the Take On Board community to do the same. Now, let me tell you about Olivia. Olivia is on the boards of Homeward Bound as a board director and the former chair of the Audit, Risk and Finance Committee. She was formerly on the boards of OARA, the Esophageal Atresia Research Association, there's a mouthful, and St Kevin's Ormond Out of Hours School Care Association. She is the current CEO of Homeward Bound, so that's interesting in and of itself, folks. We might come back to it on the board and CEO, but we'll come back to that. Homeward Bound is a global leadership initiative for women leaders with a STEM background. She's also held several chief risk officer, risk and audit roles across public sector and ASX-listed environments. Olivia has a keen interest in how people experience risk through behaviour, decisions and culture. My punt is we will definitely touch on that today. So welcome to the Take On Board podcast, Olivia.
Thank you very much, Helly. Very pleased to be here with you.
Oh, it is so great to have you here. Folks out there in the Take On Board world, Olivia and I met up just a couple of weeks ago to talk about, Homeward Bound and all sorts of things. And we got talking about risk. And I said, I'm doing a podcast mini-series on chairing. So before you know it, here she is doing the podcast episode. So thank you for taking the call. Before we dive into chairing risk committees and how important it is and how that sets the culture, as always, I want to just dig a little bit deeper about you. Tell me, what was young Olivia like? And when did you get your first inkling that you might end up in the boardroom?
Young Olivia. Creative, loud, energetic, and interestingly enough, a really early sense of kind of fairness and justice at a very young age. And I often wonder whether that kind of led me down the risk and audit and path, eventually leading to board roles. But that would be how I describe my younger self.
Interesting. Okay, so hang on. I have to back this up a bit. So fairness and justice, risk and audit. Help me out here in how they connect and how this real interest in fairness and justice led to risk and audit. I'm sure the connection's there. I don't doubt it at all. But as a non-specialist in the area, just help me out on the connection.
Yeah, sure. I think I've always seen, risk functions and audit functions as just another perspective in organisations. Helping people who are leading organisations and are often really pressed for time, really under pressure, making decisions in uncertain environments. Functions like risk, like audit, many of their second line functions, finance falls into that, I guess, as well, can be that second pair of eyes and that support and guidance and advice to executives in those other roles in the organisation. So, I don't know if it's exactly fairness and justice, but I guess something in the risk space as well is that ability to, work with executives around decision making and really think about sort of the impact of decisions. And often, depending on where you are in the organisation, there'll be certain impacts that are really obvious and, they come into your mind straight away when you're trying to make a decision, whether you're in a sales function or in other functions in the organisation. But really, those monitoring or kind of second line functions can really take a step back and say, well, have we considered this? Have we considered that? There's always multiple impacts, and they could be positive and less positive to any action or decision we take. So that's where I've sort of, I guess, found purpose in those roles.
So that gives us a beautiful segue. Let's dive on into chairing risk committees, the role of risk committees. It feels like there's a bit of a flow in a way. There's a chair of a risk committee, and you've been the chair of at least one, possibly more than one risk committee. How that flows into the risk committee itself, how that flows into the board. I guess the influence a risk committee chair can have. So, in fact, first up is the Homeward Bound Risk Committee. Is Homeward Bound your first board?
No, those other two organisations that you mentioned,
Yes.
I was on those boards. This was the first board where I've taken an active role in the risk, chairing the risk committee, so audit, finance and risk. But obviously, and we may want to delve into this later, I've seen and reported to and interacted with risk and audit and finance committees for a long time from the other side of the table. So
excellent. So your reflections about the chairing of that might be helpful on that side as well. But tell me, so with Homeward Bound, you joined the board, you then become the chair of the risk, audit and finance committee, or however those three words are framed. They're often framed in a different order for different boards. How did you end up in the chair role?
So it was back in 2021, had met the founders, had met the board chair, had undertaken my own due diligence process into getting to know the organisation, etc. And then what appealed in terms of the value that I could add to that particular board was my risk and governance background. So the organisation, and again, they will have done the skills matrix and the assessment there. We're looking to, strengthen practices at board level, but also throughout the organisation from a risk and governance perspective. So that's how I ended up on the board. And many board members at that time were already chairing other board committees. And so I guess it made sense for me. And I also was very keen to contribute to that organisation in that way as well, in that chairing capacity.
Fantastic. Okay. So you land in the boardroom of the organisation, you land in the chair role of the Risk, Finance and Audit Committee. I know part of your, philosophy, if that's the right word, is that risk committees and boards shape the risk culture of an organisation, and they do that through behaviour and decision making. It's more than just frameworks and reporting. So I'm wondering if you can tell us how, as the chair of that board, you worked with that committee, you worked with that board, you worked with the organisation to help shape the risk culture. I'm wondering if you can just tell us a bit of that story.
So I guess, first things first is establishing and getting to know the board chair in particular, and understanding from her perspective, setting some goals for that committee, understanding, the areas and where we would like to make progress from a risk and governance perspective in the organisation. So that first port of call always is, I think, just especially joining a new board as well. If you haven't already known each other from other spaces and places, just establishing that relationship with the board chair. And then where I went from there was, again, meeting with my colleagues, my board colleagues one-on-one, and understanding from them. Many of them had been with the organisation for some time. What were their perspectives? What would they, where would they like to see progress and improvement? What was the organisation doing well already? Definitely don't want to, throw out the things that are working well. And then really, I guess, and it's hard can take quite some time to get to know people from a human perspective, and just how they operate, in that decision making space, in that action taking space. But that the key value, I think, that the chair of the risk committee can add, as well as all members of the risk committee, is that ability to step back when we're in the decision-making process and critique ourselves as we're going along. It's going to be a funny thing to say, but board directors are human beings as well.
Yes.
Often very experienced human beings, often have had, the opportunity to exercise their role in lots of different situations. But everyone has a way that they react to uncertainty. Everyone has a way that they, conscious or unconscious, that they respond to pressure, to criticism, to to opportunity as well. So I think the chair of the risk committee really can look to provide and facilitate with the fellow board members critique and feedback, and just kind of stepping back and looking at that process.
It's almost like a self-awareness of self and then self-awareness around the group, in this instance, the risk committee, making some decisions.
Every group of people that you put together, group of humans you put together will consciously or unconsciously have their own risk culture, right? Their own typical way in which they would respond to risk, to uncertainty, to opportunity as well. And again, outside pressures, I don't want to bring too much of this into it, but just our whole life experience, shapes how we respond to those things. Are we more conservative? Have we had some bad experiences in the past? Do we tend to be more in the risk-taking space? Have we had good experiences in our lives where we've taken risk, and how has that worked out for us? And all of these things, again, very much unconscious sometimes, come into play around how boards make decisions, and then again the risk committee's role in being able to delve into some of that a little bit further. And of course, any good chair facilitating that process amongst board members.
Well, I'm interested in digging into a little bit of that because, as you say, as any good chair, facilitating that process, and you say it blithely as if, of course, everybody knows how to do that and what it is, but not everybody does. I mean, we've all, I think, been in meetings, whether they're board or committee meetings or just any meetings, where then those sorts of things are not well facilitated. So for you, what are some of the tools that you've got in your toolkit? Like, what are either the formal tools, or it could just be the questions you ask, the practices you use as chair to perhaps, facilitate that conversation in a constructive way, and maybe even bring some of that unconscious into the conscious. What are some of the tools in your toolkit for that?
Outside of the board room, I think, again, doing what you can to get to know your board colleagues, your risk committee colleagues, understanding the things they're excited about, understanding their concerns, having and holding that space for them to express those things one-on-one to you, rather than, as we know, everyone contributes and everyone has different ways in which they prefer to raise questions or express opinions in board meetings. So that for me is sort of the starting point. A good agenda can help things as well, or even stepping back from the agenda, being really clear on, apart from the usual business of a risk committee or a board, where we've got decisions to make or feedback to give to management, or et cetera, being really clear on what we want to get out of that meeting, and what do we want to have progressed by the end of that meeting. And sometimes that's listed in an agenda, sometimes it's a discussion at the start of the meeting just to confirm that. And when you're in that active practice of having the meeting and having the dialogue, or watching for cues, looking at people's facial expressions. Are they biting their bottom lip because they're worried about something? Do they have excitement in their eyes because they're desperate to get a viewpoint across? Are we all looking at the papers going, these are great, but it's not telling the real story? So, how can we sit down in a constructive but kind way, pose some questions to the executive to help flush out some of those things?
You referenced the agenda there, and you referenced a number of tools, but I just want to explore that agenda conversation a little bit, because I think you referenced something about being clear on the purpose and clear on what needs to come out of that meeting, which might mean you need less on the agenda. Who set the agenda for the meetings that you were chairing? Was that you? Was it a board secretary? How did that come about that you could influence that?
So again, regular contact with the board chair, and thinking about, well, what came out of our last discussion, all of those things. Something that I've found really useful on agendas over the years is kind of 3 sections to the agenda. At the top of the agenda is for decision, X item, Y item. So we know we've got to read the paper. We might even have to have some discussions to clarify ahead. And then we know that those particular things need to be decided in the meeting. Then next section for feedback. I love being part of, and in my executive time, reporting to boards that were willing to look at something a number of times and provide input and feedback along the way. Obviously, that's very much, working within time constraints and all of those things of board members, but particularly on critical sort of strategic matters or other decisions that are going to have a significant impact on the organisation, that ability to come to the board or the risk committee, a couple of times and to develop that, with the ability to develop that further. And then down the bottom is for noting, read it, but we won't spend too much time. We might just have some question time around that in a particular meeting.
It's interesting, isn't it? I'm hearing building the relationships, building particularly a strong relationship with the chair, building a strong relationship with your colleagues that are on that committee, as well as that are on the board, because building the risk culture is across the board and the organisation. Strategically thinking about the agenda. It's so interesting. So little is about chairing the actual meeting, and so much is about the invisible work that goes around it.
It's the setup, exactly. I would say a lot of it, and it's like, so many things in life, 80% of the effort in the planning and then the execution. There is, I think, in that chairing role in the meeting itself, always offering that opportunity for all committee members or board members to raise a question, offer a comment, offer a perspective. We've all been in those meetings where we have lots of enthusiastic colleagues who very much want to get their points across or really interested in the subject matter and really want to ask all the questions. But again, just ensuring that everyone has that opportunity, like in any meeting, to be honest, and making sure that they have the opportunity to offer their perspective. And, I will probably also use the opportunity to also point out the value of having that diverse perspective in those groups as well. So I mean, both in committees and across boards, again, if we think of ourselves as humans where we have so much in common and also lots of differences, it's the differences and the different perspectives that add value to so many things. I often think of decisions kind of like a glass prism, and I might look at it and turn it this way and, have a perspective and then pass it to my colleague over there and they'll turn it a completely different way and offer a perspective. So, and again, that's in the preparation, right? Making sure you've got those voices in the room. And where you haven't got the voices in the room for a particular subject matter or decision, bringing it in, bringing that expertise in will only enrich the decision and the discussion.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I think you're right. I love that prism analogy, by the way. And for committees that are looking through the prism one way and then looking through the prism the other way, often looking through the prism in one way and everybody looking at it through it the same way, it's actually much easier to chair that sort of conversation or facilitate that sort of conversation because, everyone's on the same page or however we want to frame it. Bringing in the different perspectives can actually disrupt the conversation, and the real magic is in disrupting as you've said, disrupting in a constructive way rather than disrupting in a negative way. What have you found works for you when you're chairing those meetings to ensure those different voices, the different perspectives in the prism, that the conversation remains constructive rather than destructive?
Something that's really useful, and we've touched on it already, is being really clear on the problem we're trying to solve. What's the progress we're trying to make in this meeting, continually bringing it back to that. The other thing I've used at Homeward Bound, but also referred to in my other roles in other organisations as well, is the organisation's values as well. So again, if we get particularly stuck on a matter, or again, we have some enthusiasm, or perhaps sometimes, and we've all done this, perhaps offering comments that are not as constructive as they could be, or a particular subject matter has triggered something in us, and again, unconsciously responding to that. I think using the organisation's values and falling back on those, and just, again, trying to think about, are we behaving in accordance with those? Are we role modelling those as board members and committee members as well? Which goes back to the sort of starting point around committees and boards actually setting and giving the cues for risk culture in an organisation, and culture more broadly, of course. They would be the things. And then, of course, there's been times, Helia, where we've set the aim, we've tried to be as constructive as possible, and we're still stuck at the end of the meeting. And there's nothing like some time away and a bit of a regroup and coming back again to finish the discussion or progress the discussion. Sometimes you just hit a point and, again, coming back fresh on another day to resume the discussion, knowing when to call that, I think is a really important skill of the chair.
Absolutely. There's a reason, I'll just sleep on it is part of kind of people's thinking,
so
constructive
true.
thinking processes. Yeah.
It's like a throwaway comment, but it's
Yes.
like the resolution to probably 80% of problems in life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you referenced much earlier in our conversation that you'd also reported to a number of risk committees. I'm wondering what you've observed about other chairs in that role, what you've observed about their practice that might be valuable to share.
Chairs that ask, not just ask, but facilitate the asking of really good questions to the executive. In a way, every executive has a level of kind of nerves or discomfort about turning up to these things, right, and being grilled and questioned. So I think being clear, but asking it in such a way that the executive or whoever's being, asked feels safe to be able to answer, I think is a skill. The asking of the question, and of course the chair facilitating the asking of that question. And you could kind of always tell the ones that had a good few chats, in the week leading up to a committee meeting, and were quite clear on, this is all great information, but here's the point where we're going to sort of focus in on. Chairs and committee members who've read all the materials and absorbed the materials are pretty obvious as well to any executive turning up to those meetings. And again, it's a chairing skill, but also a committee or a board director skill. That ability to look at the papers, and particularly from a risk perspective, we're kind of dancing around, a particular issue, or my gut's telling me there's something else going on here. But again, asking those probing questions, but not in a sort of without accusing anyone or anything, I think is really important. And I'm pretty sure that takes years and years of experience to practice, honing your gut skill about your gut feel about these things. But really being able to look at them and be able to say, I feel like there's something else going on here. Let's ask some questions to see if we can get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, great. Oh, I'm hearing so much there about that. Yeah, facilitative role. It's interesting. Oh, we've covered so much about this already, Olivia, and the time travels too quick.
It sure
So
does.
I'm wondering, what are the key things you want people to take away from the conversation that we've had today?
The first one really is thinking about your risk committee, and I guess in the organisation, your risk functions, the risk committee in particular, as being that very helpful group of people who can look at your decision-making process or look at a pending decision and think through the process of that decision-making, and again, offer a perspective on the chair of the risk committee, really being able to contribute to that decision-making process and that facilitating kind of the facilitation of that to get to as good a decision as we can with the information that we have on hand, and just being really alert to the fact that everyone on a board or a committee is a human to start off with, and again, we each have our own strengths, experiences and that we bring to those roles. But again, time pressure, crisis, all of those things sometimes change how we respond and we react to those things. We touched on the paper says all good, nothing to see here, but my gut tells me there's something else going on here. So again, being able to follow your gut and ask the question, but ask the question in a way that the executive may open up to you instead of feel scared to say anything and shut down. And really, I guess, from what I've observed from both sides of the table, the actual decisions that the risk committee recommend and the board make, they send signals and cues to the rest of the organisation around where we don't want to take a risk, where we do want to take a risk. Your risk appetite statement may say one thing, but if the decision's coming down from the board, that they are really going to influence how the executive and their teams, the sort of cues that they pick up on around, again, risk, uncertainty, decision making, and what's appropriate in the organisation around that.
Is there a resource you would like to share with the Take On Board community?
Look, one that I refer to regularly, and I've sort of moved away from a lot of the technical aspects of risk practice and really interested in the behavioural side of things. And I think you've got a link to this, Helia. It's the APRA 10 risk culture dimensions, and they're split into two groups. So, there's a number of elements sitting under the architecture side. There's a number of elements sitting under the behaviour side. And again, the architecture is more about, the documents and the policies and those sorts of things. But on the behaviour side, again, I won't say regardless of what's in the document, but sometimes in spite of what's in the documents and articulated in an organisation, there's a number of elements there that, boards, committees, the executive can influence to build a strong risk culture in the organisation. And in the end, what is risk culture? Risk culture is really how we act and respond, the decisions we make under conditions of uncertainty. So I really like that graphic because it just reminds me of all those levers that boards, risk committees, CEOs have to play with in order to enable a strong risk culture in the organisation.
Amazing. Well, we'll make sure there is a link to that in the show notes for people. Oh, Olivia, thank you. Like I say, this just came from us having a coffee or a tea or a cold drink, actually. I think it was an icy bowl. It was a hot day.
It was a warm day.
So thank you so much for, taking the call and stepping up and coming and sharing your wisdom with the Take On Board community today. I really appreciate it. So thanks for being here.
Most welcome, Helia, and you're doing some really important work here, sharing stories from so many different board perspectives. So, yeah, it's fantastic. Very welcome to be here.